Every single thing we eat, every morsel, every spice, even like liquid calories.
Hmm.
It's not just something that happens naturally. It's really a direct result of centuries of global power struggles, engineering breakthroughs, and these really deep political and ecological decisions that literally shape who eats what and where.
That's exactly it. And that's really the foundation for this whole deep dive, isn't it? Because we're always told, look at food as just personal choice, or check the health labels, or just see it as buying and selling.
Right, simple transaction.
Yeah, but the second you zoom out, you see the plate on your table is, well, it's a history lesson.
Hmm.
It's a statement about class, and it's tied into this huge, complex geopolitical commitment.
Exactly. So our mission today really is to trace that history, digging into the sources. We're going right back to the moment food basically helped invent writing, and we're going to follow that thread all the way up to where it sits now, right at the center of our social crises, our climate crisis.
Hmm.
We need to look at how power, consolidated around our food supply, why our modern nutrition advice is, well, often inherently political, and why figuring out health means understanding the whole landscape, the ecology, not just getting obsessed with one nutrient on a label.
And we'll be setting that against, the incredible complexity, sometimes the fragility of our globalized industrial food system, the one that sort of promises everything, always available. Contrasting that with the search for maybe simpler, more resilient ways of doing things, ways rooted in ecological thinking and local control.
It's a fundamental journey, really, tracking how humans relate to what sustains us, from, like you said, the Sumerian storehouse, right up to the industrialized corporate food chain we have today. Okay, so let's dive in right at the beginning. The absolute foundation, the start of written history. And what's really amazing here is that the first things people bothered to write down, the earliest documents we found, they're Sumerian wage lists, tax receipts.
Exactly. And when you look at what's on those lists, it tells you everything about what mattered for organizing an early state. The sources point out that one of the most common symbols is for beer.
Beer.
Yeah, beer, drawn as a clay pot with these diagonal lines for the grain mash inside. It's right there alongside grain, textiles, livestock, the essentials.
So, okay, writing wasn't invented for epic poems or deep thoughts initially.
Not at first, no. It was basically an accounting tool,
Yeah.
a practical necessity.
Yeah.
It seems like a really logical step up from, those Neolithic practices of using tokens to keep track of who put what into the shared village storehouse.
Right, managing the communal pot.
Civilization, you could argue, needed a way to manage rations on a bigger scale. The early Sumerian city-states were just, well, more complex versions of that. The priests kind of took over the role of the village chief, collecting all the surplus barley, wheat, cloth as taxes.
Compulsory taxes.
Compulsory taxes, yeah. Supposedly offerings for the gods, but, in reality, they immediately started funding this huge, hungry administrative class. Bureaucracy.
And that bureaucracy ran on calories, literally. They used the stored grain and beer to pay people for building things, maintaining irrigation canals, all that public work.
Standardized rations, bread and beer. So food instantly becomes this tool of administration, of taxation, of early state power. It lets certain people control the flow of essentials.
And as you get more types of food, more commodities, they start to take on new roles, right?
Yeah.
Like defining social status.
Oh, absolutely. You see this fascinating shift in the classical world. We move from beer, which pretty much everyone drank, to wine in ancient Greece becoming a real status symbol.
So when wine became common enough that, as the sources say, even slaves were drinking some form of it, the game changed.
It totally changed. It wasn't if you drank wine anymore. It was what kind of wine.
Huh.
How refined were your tastes? What were the rituals around drinking it? That's where the class distinctions came in.
You had Greek gourmets like Archestratus back in the 4th century BCE writing really detailed stuff about which wines they preferred.
Exactly. Specific vintages from specific islands. Lesbos, Chios, Thasos. It was all about sophistication, knowing your stuff.
And the ritual itself sounds intense. The mixing.
The ritual is everything. So wine was almost always mixed with water. They used a big bowl, urn-shaped, called a crater, and it was crucial, apparently, that you added the water to the wine, not the other way around. Shows control, maybe.
And the ratios mattered.
The ratios determined everything, because they controlled how quickly people got drunk at the symposium, the formal drinking party.
Right, keep things intellectual, supposedly.
Supposedly.
Yeah.
So typical mixes were like 2 parts water to 1 wine, maybe 5 to 2, 3 to 1, 4 to 1, but mixing a half and half. equal parts.
That was bad.
That was considered strong wine, very uncivilized.
Yeah.
The mark of a barbarian, someone who couldn't handle their drink or participate in proper conversation.
Wow. And then you have the super elite taking it even further with chilling the wine.
Yeah, pure luxury. They'd cool their wine with actual snow, harvested in winter, and stored deep underground in insulated pits packed with straw.
That takes serious effort. Logistics, labor, money.
Just to get a cold drink. It really highlights how far food and drink had moved beyond just basic survival needs for the wealthy.
Yeah.
It's about displaying status.
And that kind of appetite for luxury, for goods from far away, that complex logistics, it brings us right into the early modern era, doesn't it? With coffee and tea just completely changing the game.
Totally revolutionizing things. Not just the economy, but how information itself moved around.
The coffee house boom in 17th century London is such a perfect example. Food, or rather drink, creating a new kind of information society. By 1700, London had, hundreds of these places?
Hundreds. And where you went for coffee basically told people what you did, who you were connected to. It was where specific kinds of information got shared.
They weren't just cafes, they were like specialized hubs.
Exactly. You had clergy near St. Paul's Cathedral. Politicians hung out near Westminster, swapping rumors, talking policy. The literary types, they gathered at Will's Coffee House.
And the business angle seems huge. The ones near the Royal Exchange.
Foundational.
Yeah.
Businessmen literally used them as offices. They'd keep regular hours there, hold meetings, make deals, even run options on the spot. It's why early newspapers like the Tatler actually used coffee house names as section headings.
Like a subject tag.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
These places were the information network. The 18th century internet, maybe, all centered around this new caffeinated drink.
But getting that coffee, and then especially tea, to Britain required this massive global reach. And that had some really brutal, long-lasting effects, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely brutal. If you connect the dots, Britain's growing addiction to tea, which really took off after, say, 1669, eventually drove massive shifts in imperial policy.
Because they got hooked on Chinese tea, creating this huge economic problem. Dependency.
It's exactly, a massive dependency. The East India Company initially didn't even want to look for other tea sources because their monopoly on the China trade was just so incredibly profitable, they didn't want to rock the boat.
But relying so heavily on China created this big trade imbalance. They were sending out tons of silver.
Huge amounts of silver, which Britain eventually and quite brutally decided to fix by pushing opium grown in their Indian colonies onto the Chinese market.
To balance the books for tea.
To balance the books for tea. And the legacy of that decision, driven by tea dependency, is just staggering. You can trace lines to two enormous historical events.
Which are?
First, the American Revolution, partly spurred by anger over taxes on tea, remember the Boston Tea Party. And second, the near total ruin of China following the Opium Wars.
The sources really lay it out. British policy, just trying to keep the tea flowing without losing all their silver, led directly to, rampant corruption in China, a devastated economy, and millions addicted to opium. All traced back to a desire for a particular drink.
It's sobering how a single commodity, tea in this case, could contribute so directly to the unraveling of a major civilization.
So this era of global trade kicked off in earnest around 1492, wasn't just about moving goods. It led to this irreversible collision, this transformation of ecosystems worldwide, and the human cost, the relationships formed through conquest. They were incredibly complex.
Deeply complex,
Yeah.
and often brutal. We should probably start with the man who initiated it, Christopher Columbus. He got the parades and the titles at first, right after his voyages.
Yeah, initially hailed as a hero.
But the sources suggest by the time he died, around 1506, he was actually a pretty bitter, broken man.
Why the bitterness? What went wrong for him?
Well, as it became clear, he hadn't actually found a quick route to Asia, and reports of his, let's say, severe mismanagement in the colonies started coming back. The Spanish crown basically started taking away most of the privileges they'd granted him, bit by bit.
Ouch. So he felt cheated.
He seemed to feel deeply wronged. And it looks like in his later years, he kind of retreated into this intense religious fervor, this messianic thinking. He started calling himself God's messenger, believed he was destined to reveal the new heaven and earth.
Wow.
He even wrote to the king, suggesting that he was the perfect guy to personally sail off and convert the emperor of China to Christianity. The self-aggrandizement mixed with the bitterness seems pretty profound.
And the conquests that followed him, especially in places like Peru with the Pizarro family. You mentioned the complex family structure.
Incredibly complex. So a lot of the conquistadors came from this one region in Spain,
Yeah.
Extremadura, Mountainous, tight-knit communities, many were related or knew each other well. And when they got to Peru, they started forming these, well, multicultural family webs, often by marrying or simply taking wives from the Inca nobility,
Right, merging power structures in a way.
often violently. The Pizarro family saga is wild. One of Francisco Pizarro's brothers apparently just stole the wife of the puppet Inca emperor he himself had put on the throne. Another brother, Hernando, ended up imprisoned back in Spain for over 20 years
What for?
for murdering rival Spaniards during infighting over who got what spoils from Peru. Typical conquistador drama, really.
But his imprisonment wasn't exactly harsh, was it?
And not even slightly. It shows the absurdity of the wealth flowing back. He was held in the very same fancy apartments that had once housed the captured king of France. Hernando apparently lived it up, slept late, ate and drank incredibly well, held lavish parties for Spain's elite, all while technically being a prisoner.
So the wealth from the conquest bought him luxury even in jail.
Absolutely. But behind all this drama and chaos, something even more significant was happening. The biological reshuffling of the entire plan.
Yeah.
The Columbian Exchange.
This is where crops just started moving everywhere, faster and further than ever before.
Unprecedented scale. You have old world staples, wheat, sugar, rice, bananas heading west to the Americas. And then you have these revolutionary New World crops, maize, potatoes, sweet potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate heading east to Europe, Africa, Asia.
Filling new ecological niches, basically.
Exactly, and dramatically increasing the total amount of food calories available globally. It was a food revolution.
And out of all those crops going east, the potato seems to have had the biggest impact in Europe, right?
Huge impact. Compared to wheat or rye, the potato just produced so much more food, more calories from the same patch of land. Those tubers are incredibly energy dense.
And Ireland is the classic, maybe tragic example of this.
The most dramatic example.
Yeah.
Potato allowed for this almost unbelievable population explosion in Ireland. The population went from maybe 500,000 people in 1660
Okay.
to nearly 9 million by 1840. 9 million.
Wow. That's
Estimated the country literally could not have supported more than 5 million people on its traditional crops alone. The extra calories made people healthier, more resistant to disease. Population boomed.
A 15-fold increase in under 200 years, basically fueled by one single imported crop. That seems precarious.
Utterly precarious. And that's the crucial insight, isn't it? The potato solved one problem, hunger, but it created this massive catastrophic vulnerability. Its very success led to dependence, to monoculture, no diversity.
So when the blight hit,
When Phytophthora infestans, the potato blight, arrived in the 1840s, it just wiped out the single food source that the poorest segment of the population completely relied on. Total dependency created the conditions for the Great Famine. It's like the ultimate historical warning about sacrificing resilience for short-term efficiency.
a terrifying lesson. And speaking of brutal systems tied to single crops, sugar, that seems to be the engine driving a lot of the early imperial wealth, especially in the Atlantic.
Absolutely central. And sugar and slavery, the sources are clear, were intertwined for centuries, even before Columbus. Arabs were using East African slaves on sugar plantations in the Mediterranean way back in the 12th century.
So the Portuguese didn't invent the model, they just scaled it up.
They found the perfect place for it. When they got to the Atlantic island of Madeira in the 1420s, it wasn't just new land. They transplanted that existing slave-based sugar production system there.
And accelerated it.
Massively accelerated it. They started importing huge numbers of enslaved black people from West Africa, often trading things like Portuguese wine and other European goods to African slave traders for them.
Trim.
By 1460, just a few decades later, Madeira was the world's biggest sugar producer. It had the perfect climate, it was close to the African coast for slaves, but critically, it was also geographically remote from Europe.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Conveniently out of sight, as one source puts it. The horrific violence and brutality needed to produce sugar on that scale was kept far away from the European consumers who were developing a taste for it. That distance was key.
And this collision wasn't just about crops and labor systems, it was also about fundamentally different ways of relating to the land itself, wasn't it? Especially in places like colonial New England.
Yes, a real clash of ecologies. You had the Native American ways of interacting with the environment and the European ways, and they were often completely incompatible. The result was this permanent transformation of the landscape that made the indigenous way of life basically impossible in many areas.
How so? What were the key differences in approach?
We'll take farming in southern New England. Indigenous communities often practice shifting agriculture. They understood that soil gets depleted. So when a field lost fertility, they just leave it. let it rest, recover naturally for years.
Mhm.
Using fish for fertilizer, like the English colonists later did, some sources say the Indians saw that as wholly unnecessary labor. Why force it when nature would regenerate it?
Compared to the European approach.
Completely different mindset. The
Okay.
colonists brought strict ideas about private property, about enclosure. Fences went up. Colonial land grants often demanded that the land be improved, cleared, farmed intensively within just a few years, or you'd forfeit it.
Maximum use.
Maximum individual use. That philosophy was totally at odds with the Native American practices of rotating fields, communal use, and respecting the land's natural cycles and limits.
And further north, the ecological pressure point was different, more about trade.
Less about direct competition for farmland initially, and more about the fur trade.
Mm.
Northern indigenous groups became incredibly reliant on Europeans for goods cloth, metal tools, guns, knives, and, significantly, food like corn and also alcohol.
So they needed furs to trade for these essentials.
Exactly, which meant they had to intensify their hunting, especially of animals like beaver whose pelts were in high demand. They started hunting in seasons they traditionally wouldn't have. Their whole subsistence pattern shifted from relying on a wide range of local resources to focusing heavily on just a few tradable commodities.
Becoming specialists, in a way.
And dangerously dependent specialists. One observer, Nicholas Denise, wrote in 1672 that these groups had basically abandoned all their own utensils for European ones.
Mhm.
That dependence made them extremely vulnerable to fluctuations in the fur market and the availability of European goods.
Okay, so moving forward into the modern industrial era, the power dynamics shift again. It's less about direct colonial control and more about, well, massive corporate consolidation. And what's really striking is how this wasn't just inevitable market forces at work, legal changes actually enabled it.
That's a crucial point. You can really trace a lot of this back to the rise of what's called the Bork Doctrine in anti-antitrust thinking. This gained a lot of traction in legal circles and government policy from the late 70s, early 80s onwards.
The Bork Doctrine, what was the core idea?
Basically, it argued that monopolies or market concentration weren't necessarily bad as long as the big companies delivered lower prices for consumers. That became the main goal. Consumer welfare, defined primarily as price.
So it shifted away from the older idea of antitrust.
Completely. Antitrust law used to be much more focused on protecting competitors, maintaining a diverse marketplace with lots of smaller players. The Bork Doctrine flipped it to protecting competition only insofar as it led to immediate low prices. This basically gave a green light to huge mergers and acquisitions. Big companies could gobble up smaller ones without much interference.
And the meatpacking industry is a prime example of this playing out. Companies like JBS, the slaughter barons as they're called.
A perfect case study. They grew enormous through aggressive acquisitions globally, and their own executives later admitted, quite openly in legal proceedings, that bribery was absolutely critical to their expansion, including getting into the huge U.S. market.
Critical. They actually said that.
One of the brothers stated flat out when asked if they could have done deals like buying major U.S. companies without corruption, oh, no way, it wouldn't have happened. They saw it as a necessary cost of doing business on that scale.
And they settled these massive corruption charges with the SEC, paying millions, but they just kept operating.
Around $28 million for violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, yeah. Which, for a company that size, is arguably just a rounding error, a manageable business expense. The legal climate, influenced by that antitrust shift, really hesitated to break up these giants or impose penalties that would actually stop their growth because, well, they were delivering cheap meat.
Cheap meat, but at what cost? You mentioned the impact on workers.
A huge human cost. Meatpacking used to be a pretty solid unionized middle-class job in the U.S. But after the wave of consolidation in the late 80s and onwards, driven by companies focused solely on lowering costs, those jobs became some of the lowest-paid, most dangerous industrial jobs in the country.
Can you quantify that change?
Yeah, the numbers are stark. A typical slaughterhouse worker around 1985 might make close to $11 an hour. Adjusted for inflation, that's like $30 an hour today.
Okay.
But actual wages since then have barely moved from that original $11 mark. Consolidation allowed companies to crush unions, speed up the lines, and drive labor costs down relentlessly to achieve those low prices the system now valued above almost everything else.
So while that consolidation was happening, creating cheap but maybe questionable food, there was this other thread. The fight for food purity, right? People like Harvey W. Wiley.
Dr. Wiley, yeah, head of the Bureau of Chemistry at the USDA in the early 20th century. He was leading this almost heroic, certainly dramatic effort to figure out what all the chemical preservatives being dumped into food were actually doing to people.
Yeah.
This was the era of his famous Poison Squad.
The Poison Squad. Tell us about that.
It was pretty radical for its time. He recruited volunteers, mostly young men working at the department, for what he called hygienic table trials, basically controlled experiments. Half the group would eat meals prepared with pure ingredients. The other half would get the same meals, but with carefully measured doses of a specific chemical preservative, added things like borax, salicylic acid, formaldehyde stuff that manufacturers were routinely using.
So, human guinea pigs, essentially.
Essentially, yes, to get hard data on the health effects. And his findings must have been pretty alarming because the food industry, the chemical manufacturers, and their political allies pushed back incredibly hard.
How do they push back?
Wiley was eventually directly ordered by his boss, the Secretary of Agriculture himself, to stop telling the public what his division was finding out. Stop educating consumers.
What was the rationale?
The official line was that public education wasn't part of the department's mission. Wiley argued back quite passionately that informing people would actually help honest farmers selling pure food by exposing the frauds. But he kept getting overruled. Officials would find legal loopholes to allow dubious ingredients, like certain coal tar dyes known to be unsafe, back onto the market.
So, commercial interests trumping public health, even then.
It's a recurring theme, isn't it? And that tension, that push and pull between scientific evidence for health and the commercial pressures of the food industry carries right through to our modern dietary guidelines.
You mean the food pyramid, my plate, all that advice. It's not purely science.
It's often a negotiated compromise. Think about it. Historically, the USDA had two potentially conflicting roles, promoting agriculture and advising on nutrition. For decades, the advice was basically eat more of various food groups to prevent deficiencies.
Which the food industry loved, presumably.
Of course, eat more meat, eat more dairy, eat more grains. That keeps demand high, keeps the agricultural economy humming. But then science started showing that the big health problems weren't deficiencies anymore. They were chronic diseases linked to overconsumption, heart disease, diabetes, obesity.
So the advice had to shift to eat less.
Exactly. Eat less fat, less sugar, maybe less red meat, smaller portions overall. And that advice ran headlong into fierce opposition from the industry selling those things. Eat less is a direct threat to their bottom line, especially in a market that's already producing way more food than people need.
So how did the industry adapt to that?
Brilliantly, from a marketing perspective. They seized on the discovery of vitamins and minerals. This fueled the rise of what's called nutritionism.
Nutritionism.
The idea that the real value of a food isn't the whole food itself, but the sum of its chemically identifiable parts. The vitamins, the minerals, the protein, the fiber.
Ah, so you can fortify anything.
Precisely. Suddenly, manufacturers could promote almost any product, no matter how processed or full of sugar it was, as healthy because, hey, it contains vitamin C, or it's fortified with calcium. It allowed them to slap health claims on products that were contributing to the very problems the eat less advice was trying to address.
It masked the bigger picture of processing and empty calories.
Completely. And no single product really embodies this whole industrialized food contradiction better than soda and other sugary drinks. Liquid calories.
Why are they singled out so often?
Well, many nutrition experts point to soda as possibly the single product most responsible for the obesity epidemic. And it's not just the sheer amount of sugar, though that's obviously huge.
What else?
It's how our bodies handle liquid calories. The sources emphasize that we seem to be physiologically less aware of the calories we drink compared to the calories we eat. We don't get the same fullness or satiety signals.
So it's easier to overconsume without realizing it?
Much easier, which paved the way for the whole supersizing phenomena. You know, a standard can of Coke has about 9 teaspoons of sugar. Bad enough. But then you get the 64-ounce double gulp from 7-Eleven.
How much is in that?
A staggering 44 teaspoons of sugar in one serving. 44. Companies realized they could make huge profits by targeting the heavy users, the people drinking multiple sugary drinks a day.
And they marketed this stuff cleverly too, right? Especially to parents.
Oh yeah, Tang is a great example. The Tang fruit box was a huge hit.
Yeah.
They added just a tiny bit of actual fruit juice, fortified it with vitamin C, and then marketed it brilliantly as nutrition in disguise.
Playing on parents' guilt or desire to get something healthy into their kids?
Exactly. Leveraging that desire to sneak good stuff into the diet, even though the main ingredient was still sugar and artificial flavors.
Yeah.
It's marketing genius, but it perfectly illustrates the problems of the industrialized plate.
And this model you're describing, the consolidation, the focus on cheapness, the nutritionism, this sounds like what the chef Dan Barber calls the first plate.
That's a good connection. Barber uses that term for the standard American meal, typically a big piece of industrial meat, maybe some refined grains, not much diversity. He contrasts it with the second plate.
Which is like the organic farm-to-table movement.
Right. Well-intentioned, focused on better ingredients, often local. But Barber argues even the second plate often fails ecologically because chefs still tend to demand only the prime cuts of meat or only the most popular, profitable vegetables.
Leaving the farmer with the rest of the animal, or fields of less glamorous but maybe ecologically necessary crops.
Exactly. It doesn't support the whole farm, the whole ecosystem, which leads to his idea of a third plate. But maybe we can come back to that when we talk about regeneration.
Right, because this industrialized plate, this first plate system we've built, it rests on this foundation of massive, often hidden resource use. It pushes the real environmental costs off the books, so to speak.
Absolutely externalizes them. Let's just look at energy, for instance. The sources we looked at make a really startling point about where the energy actually goes in our food system.
Okay.
Only about 1/5, maybe 20%, of all the fossil fuel energy used to get food to us is actually used on the farm itself. Planting, pesticides, fertilizer, harvesting.
Only 20%. That seems low. Where's the rest going?
The lion's share, as one source puts it, is consumed after the food leaves the farm gate.
Doing what?
Transport, processing, packaging, warehousing, and especially refrigeration and freezing. We're running this colossal, energy-hungry logistics network just to move food around and keep it stable within this centralized system. Think about this. The average mouthful of food in the U.S. travels about 1,500 miles to get to your plate.
1,500 miles. Wow. Okay, so the energy needed to grow the food is almost minor compared to the energy needed to just move it, process it, and wrap it up.
It completely flips the script on where the energy burden lies. And that reliance on long-distance transport, on centralization, puts incredible pressure on resources in the places where the food is grown, especially water.
We're essentially shipping water across continents, hidden in fruits and vegetables.
We really are. California is the starkest example. Huge areas of farmland there are technically desert. They get less than 10 inches of rain a year.
Yet they grow thirsty crops.
Exactly. Agriculture in California uses something like 80% of all the developed water in the state.
Yeah.
80%.
That's unsustainable.
And look at almonds. California's almond crop alone uses more water annually than the combined water use of all the people living in Los Angeles and San Francisco.
Just for almonds.
Just for almonds.
No.
We're pumping irreplaceable groundwater, diverting rivers, all to grow water-intensive crops in arid regions, largely because the centralized system demands it for the global market.
And this whole industrial farming model, it really got locked in by the Green Revolution, didn't it? But the critique you mentioned earlier suggests it wasn't just about miracle seeds.
No, it was fundamentally tied to the chemical industry. The sources argue that the fire-and-forget school of farming, think Roundup-ready crops engineered to withstand herbicides, didn't really spring from a pure desire to feed the world's poor.
Where did it come from then?
It was more like an extension of the chemical industry's existing product lines. After World War II, factories that had been making nitrogen for explosives easily pivoted to making synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. The pesticides often came from research into chemical weapons.
So the Green Revolution wasn't just high-yield seeds. It was high-yield seeds designed to need massive amounts of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides.
Exactly, creating this perpetual dependency. You needed their seeds, which needed their chemicals. It locked farmers into a specific industrial model.
And that model, with its focus on chemicals and heavy tillage, has had devastating effects on soil health itself, right?
Severe long-term costs. There's a great analogy in one of the sources. It compares conventional farming to trying to raise all children on bread, peanut butter, and the same bedtime story.
Meaning
It's simplified to the point of starvation. Conventional farming typically only puts back the big three nutrients, NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. It ignores the dozens of other micronutrients plants need, and more importantly, it completely neglects the living ecosystem in the soil.
the microbes, the fungi.
All the microscopic life that actually makes nutrients available to plants. And it gets worse. Some recent science shows that adding high levels of phosphorus, the P in NPK, can actually kill off the beneficial mycorrhizal fungi.
Kill them off. But don't plants need those fungi?
They form this crucial symbiotic relationship. The fungal filaments extend way beyond the plant's roots, bringing back water and nutrients the plant can't reach on its own. Dumping phosphorus basically tells the plant, you don't need your fungal partners anymore. And that network dies off, making the plant even more dependent on artificial inputs.
So tillage breaks up the soil structure, chemicals kill the microbes. What does that do to the overall balance?
It completely shifts the soil ecology. Healthy soil, like in a forest, might have a really high fungi to bacteria ratio, maybe 100 to 1 or even higher. Fungi are key for building stable soil structure and long-term nutrient cycling.
And conventional farmland.
Bare, tilled, chemically treated soil. The ratio flips dramatically. It becomes heavily bacterial, maybe 1 to 100 bacteria to fungi. Bacteria break down organic matter quickly, releasing nutrients in a rush, but they don't build long-term health. The soil becomes leaky, compacted, dependent.
This is the ecological crisis underpinning the first plate.
Exactly. And this is why the whole concept of regenerative agriculture is gaining so much traction. It's the foundation for Dan Barber's third plate idea we mentioned.
So what's the goal of regenerative agriculture?
It's about actively restoring that degraded land back to health. A key goal is often to rebuild that soil life, aiming for a much healthier fungi to bacteria ratio, maybe somewhere between 1 to 1 and 5 to 1. It's about working with the soil biology, not against it.
Moving beyond just sustainable, which can mean just not making things worse, to actually making things better.
Precisely. And it embraces complexity and synergy, which is a core idea in permaculture, too. Think about the ancient Three Sisters planting method used by indigenous Americans.
Corn, beans, and squash grown together.
Right. It's a perfect ecological guild. The corn provides a stalk for the beans to climb. The beans fix nitrogen from the air, fertilizing the soil for all three. And the squash spreads out low to the ground, shading the soil, conserving moisture, and suppressing weeds.
They help each other.
They create a system that's more productive and resilient than growing each crop alone. Studies show the total calorie yield from a Three Sisters plot can be 20% higher than just growing corn in the same space. It's about using nature's patterns to minimize work and inputs while maximizing output.
And connecting this back to the plate, Barber's argument is that the menu should follow this ecological logic.
That's the revolutionary part of the third plate. Instead of the chef demanding specific things from the farm's ecological needs dictate the menu. If the soil needs legumes to build nitrogen, then legumes become a central part of the cuisine. If cover crops are needed, find delicious ways to use them. It might mean smaller portions of meat, used more as flavoring, integrated into dishes built around grains and vegetables that heal the land.
Eating the whole rotation, essentially.
Eating the whole rotation,
Yeah.
valuing every part of the farm cycle.
Yeah.
Which naturally leads to the question, can this kind of change happen through the existing centralized global system? Or does the solution have to be more localized?
Yeah, if the global system is built on consolidation and pushing costs outward, can it really fix itself?
Many proponents of localization and regeneration argue probably not. They suggest the time for relying solely on top-down global capitalist structures to solve these ecological and social crises might have passed.
So the alternative is building resilience locally.
Increasing local autonomy. There's a strong argument that small-scale farming systems, designed specifically for their local environment, can address problems in ways that big, standardized systems just can't. It might mean focusing less on earning a bigger wage to buy industrial food and more on, say, having a bigger garden, supporting local farmers, strengthening community food networks.
A different kind of wealth, almost.
A different kind of wealth, one that's often, as one source notes, antithetical to the pure logic of maximizing capital. It prioritizes resilience, community, connection to place over just efficiency and profit.
Are there examples of this kind of local system persisting?
Definitely. Look at the Haitian tradition of convit. It's a system of communal farm labor with roots in West Africa that developed among enslaved people forced into subsistence farming.
People helping each other on their plots.
Exactly. A system of mutual aid and cooperation. And it continues today, often centered around the leku, the traditional family compound. What's interesting is how these communities often consciously prioritize traditional, locally adapted foods, things like root vegetables, cornmeal, beans over imported, less resilient foods like spaghetti or white rice, even when those imports might be cheaper temporarily. It's about maintaining food sovereignty and cultural heritage.
It's really quite a journey we've taken. We started with, Sumerian accountants tracking beer on clay tablets. And now we're down at the level of mycorrhizal fungi in the soil and Haitian communal work teams. It shows how deeply food connects everything.
It absolutely does. It highlights the scale of the choices we make, consciously or unconsciously, with every meal. You have this dominant global system pushing for consolidation, for complex processed foods, for hiding the true environmental costs.
But the history and the ecological science seem to point in another direction, towards simplicity, diversity, local adaptation.
Toward resilience, toward nutritional integrity. The lesson from the Irish potato famine, the danger of monoculture and dependency, is fundamentally the same lesson we need to learn from today's industrial monocultures, propped up by chemicals.
We've seen how food choices are tangled up in huge forces. Geopolitics, like tea driving the Opium War, class struggle, played out in the rituals of drinking Greek wine, and now our literal ecological survival depending on things like soil health.
And the goal, as people advocating for regenerative systems or the third plate argue, has to shift. It's not just about sustaining things as they are or even doing less harm. It's about designing meals, designing food systems that actively improve the health of the land and the community.
So the final thought for you listening. If the whole drive of industrial agriculture has been towards simplification, simplifying the landscape, simplifying the genetics, simplifying the supply chain, all in the name of efficiency, what hidden complexities, what unintended consequences are we building into our future by accepting that forced simplicity? What systems, what values are you actually supporting with your next meal?